Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A perplexing crime. It was on a particularly dreary evening in the autumn of 1895 that I, Dr. John Watson, found myself once again at 221B Baker Street, drawn into the peculiar affairs of my esteemed companion, Sherlock Holmes. The lamplight flickered against the rain-slicked cobblestones outside, and the familiar scent of tobacco smoke curled through the air of our sitting room. Holmes, in his dressing gown, lounged in his armchair, his sharp eyes fixed upon the flames in the hearth, as though deciphering some unseen cipher within them. I had scarcely settled into my own chair when the sharp rap of the door-knocker disturbed the quietude. Mrs. Hudson, ever the diligent landlady, admitted our visitor. A tall, distinguished gentleman, his face lined with the wear of years spent in service to the crown. His grey temples and piercing blue eyes lent him the air of a man accustomed to command, yet his fingers twitched upon his hat with the nervous energy of one deeply troubled. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice steady, yet edged with urgency. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, and you, sir, are Colonel Nathaniel Harrington, formerly of the British Museum's Egyptology Department, now acting curator at the Royal Academy." The man started, his mouth opening slightly in astonishment. How could you possibly know that?" Holmes waved a languid hand. "Pray, be seated, Colonel. Watson, take note, for this promises to be of interest." As the Colonel settled into the chair opposite, he took a steadying breath and leaned forward. "Mr. Holmes, I am here on a matter of utmost urgency, one that Scotland Yard has dismissed as a common burglary, though I assure you it is anything but. An artifact of immense historical value has been stolen, an artifact said to be cursed." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Ah, cursed, you say? Fascinating. Do continue." "The artifact in question," the Colonel said gravely, "is the dagger of the Pharaoh, a relic from the tomb of Akhenaten, brought to London under the strictest secrecy. 3 nights ago it vanished from the Royal Academy. The display case was found shattered, and a single word was left behind: Anubis. Watson and I exchanged glances. "Anubis, the god of the afterlife?" I asked. "Precisely," Harrington confirmed. "And what is more, the night watchman, Mr. Alfred Woodley, was found dead beside the empty case. A look of pure terror was frozen upon his face. The police believe it was a heart attack, but I am not so certain. Mr. Holmes, I fear that the true nature of this crime is far darker than mere theft. I implore you, find the dagger before more lives are claimed." Holmes steepled his fingers, a gleam of intrigue in his eyes. "Colonel Harrington, you have my full attention." "Oh, the peculiarities of the case." Colonel Harrington's declaration hung in the air like an ominous spectre. Holmes, ever composed, regarded him with keen interest, his fingers still steepled beneath his chin. "A most curious affair indeed," he mused. "A stolen artifact, a cryptic message, and a corpse left in terror. Certainly, Scotland Yard must have formulated some theory, however feeble." Harrington exhaled sharply. "They are content to call it a simple burglary gone awry. Inspector Lestrade." Holmes sighed. Ah, Lestrade, that explains much. Believes that common thieves broke in, panicked when discovered, and fled with their prize, leaving poor Woodley to die from fright or exertion. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, I have seen battlefields, and men felled by forces both natural and unnatural. That man did not simply die of fright. There was something wrong about his expression. Holmes tapped his fingers together in thought. You speak of a look of pure terror. Describe it. Harrington swallowed, clearly unsettled by the memory. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes wide, staring, bulging almost, as though he had seen something beyond human comprehension. Interesting. Holmes stood abruptly, crossing the room to the fireplace. He took up his pipe, filled it with tobacco, and lit it with a match, the flame casting flickering shadows upon his angular features. Watson, ever attuned to his friend's mannerisms, knew that Holmes was already constructing the architecture of the case within his formidable mind. I fetched my notebook, ready to record what was certain to be an extraordinary deduction. "Colonel," Holmes continued, "tell me everything you know about the dagger itself." Harrington nodded. The dagger of the Pharaoh is an artifact of extraordinary significance. It was recovered during an expedition to Amarna, the ancient city of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Some claim it was used in ritual sacrifices. Others believe it was a ceremonial blade of divine protection. But most intriguingly, there is a legend associated with it, one that speaks of a curse upon any who dare to possess it. Holmes let out a faint chuckle. "Curses, Colonel, are often the refuge of scoundrels and the superstitious." Harrington frowned. "Perhaps, but consider this. The expedition leader, Sir Alfred Montgomery, who oversaw the excavation, died mysteriously only weeks after discovering the dagger. His assistant vanished without a trace. The British Museum hesitated to take possession of the artifact, and yet the Royal Academy insisted on the display. 3 nights after its arrival, it disappears, and a man dies under inexplicable circumstances." Watson shifted uneasily. "Holmes, surely even you must admit the peculiar pattern of deaths surrounding this dagger." Holmes exhaled a cloud of smoke, his gaze distant but calculating. "Patterns, Watson, are only meaningful when the data is complete. What we have is an intriguing puzzle, but the supernatural is seldom the answer. No, this crime is the work of flesh and blood hands." He turned sharply to Harrington. "I presume you have a full list of those with access to the exhibit?" "I do," Harrington replied. "Staff, scholars, select patrons." "Excellent. We shall require it. Additionally, you mentioned the word Anubis being left behind. Was it written, painted, scrawled onto the display case in what appeared to be," he hesitated, "blood?" Watson and I exchanged another glance. Even Holmes paused before speaking again. "Then, Colonel," he said at last, "it is imperative that Watson and I inspect the scene at once." Harrington exhaled in relief. "The Royal Academy is at your disposal, Mr. Holmes. I only hope we are not already too late." Holmes retrieved his coat and hat, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Come, Watson, the game is afoot." The crime scene examination. The hansom cab rattled through the rain-soaked streets of London, as Holmes, Watson, and Colonel Harrington made Their way to the Royal Academy. The night air carried the scent of damp stone and coal smoke, and the gas lamps cast flickering shadows against the grand facades of the city's institutions. Holmes remained silent for much of the journey, his sharp profile illuminated in brief flashes as we passed the streetlights. I had long since learned not to interrupt him during such moments. His mind was sifting through the details, arranging and rearranging possibilities before we had even set foot at the scene. The Royal Academy loomed ahead, its imposing columns standing as sentinels of knowledge and antiquity. A watchman admitted us through the side entrance, where a uniformed officer stood guard, a precaution, no doubt, after the theft and the death of Mr. Woodley. "Inspector Lestrade has been here," Harrington murmured as we stepped inside. He conducted a thorough examination. Holmes sniffed. I dare say his thorough examination involved drawing premature conclusions and ignoring that which did not fit them. Let us see what the scene itself tells us. The Egyptian exhibit lay at the end of a grand hall, shrouded in dim light. The moment we entered, an unnatural stillness seemed to settle over the room. Before us stood the shattered display case, the remnants of glass still littering the polished floor, though the dagger itself was nowhere to be seen. Holmes knelt beside the case, his sharp gaze sweeping across the debris. Watson, ever the diligent observer, noted the stark contrast between his own perceptions and those of his friend. Where he saw broken glass and an empty stand, Holmes saw meaning. "Note the pattern of the shards, Watson," he murmured. "The breakage suggests a single, deliberate strike, not the panicked flailing of a common thief." He gestured to a portion of the case where the impact seemed most severe. A professional job, executed with precision. Harrington cleared his throat. "And the writing?" Holmes stood, his gaze shifting to the ominous scrawl upon the remaining glass panel. The word Anubis had been written in dark, smeared strokes. The inspector's initial assessment had been that of blood, but Holmes dipped a gloved finger into the dried substance, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. "Not blood," he murmured. "At least not entirely. A mixture of some organic compound, perhaps paint, perhaps something more theatrical. We shall have to analyze it further." Watson frowned. But why write Anubis? If this were a simple burglary, why leave such a deliberate message? Holmes gave a faint smile. "Ah, Watson, that is precisely the question we must answer. A message implies an audience, does it not? Either our thief wishes to frighten us, or to misdirect us." Harrington exhaled. "And Woodley, his body, was found here." He gestured to a spot just beyond the display. "Collapsed in the very act of his duty." Holmes paced to the location, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the floor. He crouched, studying the polished marble. Then, without warning, he produced a magnifying lens from his coat and scrutinized something minuscule. "Aha!" Watson stepped forward. "Holmes." "A faint indentation," Holmes murmured. "Not a footprint, but an impression. And here," he pointed to a barely perceptible smear. "A trace of oil or wax, perhaps." He stood, suddenly, his expression unreadable. "I shall require access to Mr. Woodley's belongings," he said. "His coat, his keys, anything he carried that night." Harrington nodded. "I can have them brought to you." Holmes smiled thinly. Excellent. For I believe, gentlemen, that we are dealing with something far more elaborate than a simple theft. I watched as my friend's mind worked at a feverish pace. The case had begun in earnest, and already I sensed that Holmes was glimpsing a truth that remained obscured to the rest of us. The shadow of guilt. The air inside the Royal Academy was thick with the scent of old parchment and polished wood, as Holmes, Watson, and Colonel Harrington made their way to the curator's office. Harrington had sent for Mr. Woodley's personal effects, and while they waited, Holmes's mind remained in constant motion, his fingers drumming against his coat pocket. The arrival of a short, thin man in a well-tailored suit interrupted Holmes's silent contemplation. His hair was slicked back, his sharp nose twitched at the sight of us, and his spectacles glinted in the dim light of the hallway. Dr. Percival Gresham, Harrington introduced, our resident Egyptologist and the man responsible for cataloguing the dagger. Gresham's gaze flickered between the three men before settling on Holmes. "You must be the famous detective," he said, his tone clipped. "I have heard much of your work." Holmes inclined his head. "And yet you do not appear delighted by my presence." The Egyptologist stiffened. "I am a man of science, Mr. Holmes. I deal in facts, not," he waved a hand, "dramatic theatrics. This entire situation has been blown out of proportion. The so-called curse is nothing more than folklore, and now a valuable artifact is missing because of it." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And what, pray, is your theory?" "A thief, of course," Gresham replied. "One with an unfortunate flair for the dramatic. They likely scribbled Anubis to feed the superstition surrounding the artifact." "And Mr. Woodley's death?" Watson interjected. Gresham hesitated. "Unfortunate. But the man was old, and fear can play tricks on the heart." Holmes took a step closer. "Were you here the night of the theft, Dr. Gresham?" The question landed like a hammer. Gresham's nostrils flared. No. I had already retired for the evening. I arrived the next morning to find the chaos left behind." Holmes studied him for a long moment before turning away. Curious. Before Gresham could respond, the door opened and an elderly porter entered, carrying a small bundle. "Mr. Woodley's effects, sir." Harrington took the bundle and placed it on the desk. Holmes wasted no time, meticulously inspecting each item. His pocket watch, a set of keys, a handkerchief, and a small leather notebook. Holmes flipped, opened the notebook. The pages were mostly filled with mundane observations about Woodley's daily duties, but toward the end, a hurried, uneven scrawl caught Watson's attention. "He watches from the dark, eyes like embers. The jackal god walks among us." Watson felt a shiver creep up his spine. Holmes read the passage twice, his brow furrowing. Then, without a word, he reached into the folds of Woodley's coat and withdrew something nearly imperceptible. A small scrap of dark fabric, its edges frayed. He examined it under his lens. "Fascinating," he murmured. Gresham, who had been observing with increasing discomfort, suddenly cleared his throat. "If there is nothing else, I have pressing work to attend to." Holmes didn't stop him. As Gresham hurried from the room, Watson turned to his friend. "You suspect him?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I suspect everyone, Watson, but I never settle for the obvious." He pocketed the scrap of fabric. "Come, we have much to uncover. The true game is only beginning." The hidden inconsistency. Holmes was unusually quiet as we left the curator's office, his long fingers toying with the scrap of dark fabric he had extracted from Woodley's coat. Colonel Harrington led us down the dimly lit corridor, the echoes of our footsteps mingling with the distant hum of the gas lamps. "I assume," I ventured, "that you have already drawn some conclusion about this case, Holmes." He stopped abruptly and turned to me with a glint of amusement in his eyes. "A conclusion, Watson? Hardly. But I have identified the question we must answer next. And that is—" Holmes held up the fabric between his fingers. "Where have I seen this material before?" Before I could reply, a sudden commotion echoed from the far end of the hallway. A voice, sharp with authority, called out, "You have no right to question me like this." We turned to see a short, broad-shouldered man in a worker's uniform arguing with a police constable. His face was ruddy with frustration, and his fists clenched at his sides. Harrington exhaled. "That's George Pratt, the night porter. He was on duty when the dagger was stolen." Holmes strode toward the scene with purpose. "Then he is precisely the man I wish to speak with." The constable stepped back as Holmes approached, his sharp gaze falling upon Pratt. The porter shifted uncomfortably under Holmes's scrutiny. "You were present on the night of the crime," Holmes said. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Pratt hesitated. "I already told the yard. I was at my post near the main hall when I heard a noise from the Egyptian exhibit. When I arrived, the glass case was broken, and poor Mr. Woodley was on the ground." He swallowed hard. "I swear, I didn't see no one else." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And yet you are troubled by something." Pratt shifted from foot to foot, his gaze darting toward Harrington before he lowered his voice. It's foolishness, Mr. Holmes, but I could swear I saw something moving in the shadows, just for a second. A tall figure gliding like what, Mr. Pratt?" Pratt sighed, shaking his head. "Like it weren't human." A heavy silence followed. "Superstitious nonsense," Harrington muttered, though there was no conviction in his voice. Holmes, however, seemed more intrigued than skeptical. He stepped closer to Pratt, studying the man's uniform. Then, without warning, he reached forward and plucked something from Pratt's sleeve. A tiny fibre of dark fabric, identical to the one from Woodley's coat. Holmes smiled. "Ah." Pratt's eyes widened. "What?" Holmes held up the fabric between his fingers, then tucked both samples into his pocket. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Pratt. Most helpful indeed." Pratt opened his mouth to protest, but Holmes had already turned on his heel, striding toward the exit with renewed purpose. Watson hurried after him, struggling to keep pace. "Holmes, what is it?" Holmes tapped his fingers against his chin. "The pieces are falling into place, Watson. There is something quite wrong with this entire affair." "And this fabric, what does it mean?" Holmes merely smiled. "For now, let us say that I have uncovered an inconsistency, one that suggests our murderer may not be who we assume." Watson frowned. "Then who?" Holmes's eyes glimmered in the dim light. "That, dear Watson, is what we must now determine. A second crime and a deadly revelation. It was well past midnight when Holmes and I arrived back at 221B Baker Street. But my companion showed no signs of fatigue. He moved about our sitting room with restless energy, arranging the two scraps of dark fabric side by side on the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows over his face as he examined the fibres under his magnifying lens. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "this fabric, coarse, tightly woven, and slightly frayed at the edges, is of a most peculiar origin." I leaned in, and yet, Holmes, I fail to see what this tells us beyond the fact that both Mr. Woodley and the porter Pratt came into contact with it. Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly. But the question remains how, and more importantly, who else might have done the same?" Before I could press him further, a sharp knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Mrs. Hudson, her face pale with worry, entered a moment later. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He insists. It's urgent." Holmes waved his hand. "Show him in." A man in police uniform stepped forward. It was Inspector Lestrade, his usually impassive face drawn with tension. "Holmes, we've got another one," he said grimly. Holmes's expression sharpened. "Another what, Lestrade?" Lestrade exhaled. "Another dead man." A silence hung in the air before he continued. "Dr. Percival Gresham, found in his study an hour ago, stabbed through the heart." Watson stiffened. "Good Lord!" Lestrade nodded. "The scene is a mess. Papers everywhere, as if there was a struggle. But the most damning part, something was left on his desk." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Let me guess. The word Anubis." Lestrade's eyes widened. "How the devil—" Holmes stood abruptly, reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson. The game has taken a darker turn." We arrived at Dr. Gresham's residence to find the constables already stationed at the door. The interior of the house was cluttered with books and artifacts from his studies, evidence of a man consumed by his work. But it was in his study that the true horror awaited us. Dr. Gresham sat slumped in his chair, his spectacles still perched on the bridge of his nose, though his lifeless eyes stared at nothing. A dagger protruded from his chest, buried to the hilt. Blood had soaked into his waistcoat, forming a deep crimson stain. Watson, ever the physician, moved instinctively to examine the body. "Still warm," he murmured. "The attack occurred within the last hour." Holmes, meanwhile, ignored the body and moved straight to the desk. His eyes swept over the chaos. Scattered papers, overturned books, and at the centre of it all, the single word smeared across the wooden surface in what looked like ink. Anubis. Lestrade folded his arms. "Now tell me this ain't connected." Holmes studied the writing for a long moment. Then, moving with practised efficiency, he examined the dagger embedded in Gresham's chest. "A most interesting choice of weapon," he mused. Watson frowned. "You recognize it?" Chimzu nodded. "Indeed, this gentleman is no ordinary blade. It is an Egyptian ceremonial dagger, one strikingly similar to the dagger of the Pharaoh." A stunned silence followed. "But that's impossible," Lestrade muttered. "The dagger was stolen." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely." He turned to Lestrade. I require a full inventory of Dr. Gresham's research, any correspondences he received in the last month, and, most importantly, anyone who knew he would be here alone tonight. Lestrade nodded. I'll have my men get on it. Holmes turned to Watson. My dear friend, I believe we are in the presence of a mind both cunning and cruel. This is no mere theft. It is a carefully orchestrated performance. Watson exhaled. Then what's the next step? Holmes's gaze darkened. We set the stage for our own performance. Setting the trap. It was nearing dawn by the time we returned to Baker Street, yet Holmes showed no signs of weariness. His eyes burned with an almost feverish intensity as he paced the room, fingers drumming against his forearm in restless calculation. I, on the other hand, slumped into my chair, exhaustion settling upon me like a lead weight. You have a plan, then? I asked, suppressing a yawn. Holmes halted mid-step and turned to me with a sharp glint in his eye. Of course, Watson. The pieces of this puzzle are at last beginning to form a coherent image. But before I act, I must confirm one final suspicion. He strode to the fireplace, where the morning newspapers had been neatly stacked by Mrs. Hudson. With a swift flick, he retrieved the Times and scanned the front page. A satisfied smile curled his lips. Just as I thought, he murmured, tossing the paper onto the table. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. The bold headline read, Egyptian Dagger Mystery Deepens. Second murder linked to stolen artifact. Beneath it, a detailed account of Dr. Gresham's murder was laid out, along with speculation on its connection to the theft at the British Museum. The article named Colonel Harrington, Mr. Woodley, and even George Pratt as key figures in the investigation. Holmes tapped the page. This, Watson, is precisely what our killer wished for. Public hysteria. The illusion of an ancient curse at work. Then you believe the murders are meant to mislead? Holmes nodded. More than that. They are a calculated maneuver, designed to manipulate, to drive suspicion toward a false narrative. He steepled his fingers. And I intend to disrupt it. I watched as he reached for his violin and played a low, contemplative note. It was a habit of his when deep in thought. The melody curled through the room like a whispered secret. What do you require, Holmes? I asked. He ceased playing and set the violin aside. First, I require a note delivered to Inspector Lestrade, instructing him to summon all key players to the museum tonight. Harrington, Woodley, Pratt, and any other interested parties. I frowned. And the reason? Holmes's eyes gleamed. I shall inform them that new evidence has surfaced, evidence that will expose the true culprit. I started. But Holmes, what evidence? A cryptic smile touched his lips. Why, Watson, the kind that does not yet exist, but soon will. The bait is set. That evening, as instructed, all relevant parties gathered in the dimly lit halls of the AAO British Museum. The Egyptian exhibit loomed in eerie silence, the shattered display case still bearing the scars of the crime. Gas lamps flickered against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows. Holmes stood at the centre, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sharp as a falcon's. Lestrade, his expression wary, stood beside him. Colonel Harrington was the first to speak. Mr. Holmes, I hope you have not gathered us here simply to waste our time. Holmes inclined his head. On the contrary, Colonel, I have gathered you here to witness the unmasking of a murderer." A tense murmur rippled through the group. Mr. Woodley adjusted his cravat. "You mean to say you have solved the case?" "Indeed," Holmes replied smoothly, "and I intend to reveal the culprit tonight." The room fell into a hush. Even George Pratt, pale and nervous, seemed to hold his breath. Holmes took a deliberate step forward. "But first I must ask, does anyone else hear that?" A puzzled silence followed. Then, from the corridor beyond, a faint tap, tap, tap echoed through the museum. Lestrade stiffened. "What in blazes?" The sound grew louder, deliberate, measured. A shadow flickered against the far wall. Then it emerged. A tall, robed figure stepped into the light, its face obscured beneath the golden mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god. A collective gasp rose from the gathered men. Woodley took an unsteady step back. "The curse!" Pratt whispered hoarsely. "It's real." But Holmes did not flinch. Instead, he took a step toward the figure, his voice calm. "You have played your part well. But the act ends now." The masked figure hesitated, and then Holmes lunged. With a single swift motion, he tore the mask away. Gasps of shock filled the hall. The murderer stood exposed. Holmes smiled. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to the true architect, and of this crime." The unmasking of the culprit. A stunned silence filled the British Museum's Egyptian hall as the golden mask of Anubis tumbled to the floor, clattering against the marble. The man beneath the disguise blinked in the flickering gaslight, his face pale and taut with fury. "Dr. Julian Whitmore," Holmes declared, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Or should I say, the self-proclaimed guardian of ancient relics." Lestrade, recovering from his shock, surged forward. "You mean to tell me this man is behind the murders?" Whitmore stiffened, his breath quickening, but he did not speak. His sharp, angular features twitched with the strain of holding his composure. Holmes tilted his head. "It was quite the performance, Doctor. The stolen dagger, the fabricated curse, the carefully staged murders, all designed to convince the world that the wrath of Anubis had claimed its victims." He turned to the assembled men. "Gentlemen, I give you the true orchestrator of this deception." Woodley exhaled sharply. But why?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "The answer lies in Dr. Gresham's study, does it not, Whitmore?" The archaeologist's jaw tightened, but still he said nothing. Holmes paced slowly, his voice steady and deliberate. "It was Gresham who first acquired the dagger for the museum, a prize meant for public display. But not all agreed with that decision, did they? There were whispers among the academic circles, disputes over whether the artifact belonged in a museum or should be returned to its origins." He turned suddenly, his sharp gaze pinning Whitmore in place. "You, Dr. Whitmore, were one of the loudest voices in that debate." Pratt, who had remained silent until now, swallowed hard. I remember now. Whitmore often spoke of preserving the legacy of the ancients. He claimed some artifacts were never meant to be removed from their sacred places. Holmes nodded. "Exactly. But when his protests failed, when the museum secured the dagger regardless, he turned to more extreme measures." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. You're saying he killed for the sake of a relic? Holmes let the question linger before continuing. Dr. Gresham's murder was personal. They had been colleagues once, perhaps even friends. But Gresham stood in the way of Whitmore's vision. By murdering him and making it appear as though the curse had claimed him, Whitmore fueled the hysteria surrounding the artifact. He intended to force the museum to reconsider. Woodley let out a breath. And what of Colonel Harrington? Holmes's gaze darkened. Collateral damage. The colonel may not have been Whitmore's primary target, but he was an influential voice in the matter. His mysterious death only strengthened the illusion of the curse. Whitmore, his shoulders trembling, finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, bitter. You think you understand, Holmes, but you do not. The world takes and takes from history, stripping sacred lands of their treasures, parading them in glass cases for idle gawkers. I sought to restore what was stolen. The dagger belonged in its rightful place, not here in this museum of thieves. A tense silence followed. Holmes, ever composed, merely studied him. And for that, you resorted to murder. Whitmore exhaled sharply, his hands clenching at his sides. He had been unmasked, both literally and figuratively, and he knew it. Lestrade pulled out his handcuffs. That's enough out of you. He stepped forward. Dr. Julian Whitmore, you are under arrest for the murders of Colonel Harrington and Dr. Percival Gresham. Whitmore did not resist as the cuffs were snapped onto his wrists. He merely stared past them all, his gaze fixed upon the broken display case where the dagger of the Pharaoh had once rested. Holmes, observing him, carefully murmured, "The true tragedy, Watson, is that there was brilliance in his convictions. But brilliance untempered by reason is often a dangerous thing." Watson sighed. "Indeed, Holmes. But tell me, when did you first suspect him?" Holmes's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Ah, Watson, that is a tale worth telling. But first, I believe we have one final matter to resolve." He turned his attention to the dagger, now safely locked away once more. The question remains, he mused, whether the dagger's journey has truly ended, or if another will one day try to claim it again. The case concludes. The cold morning air bit through my coat as Holmes and I stepped outside the British Museum. The dawn had broken over London, its pale light washing over the city's rooftops. Behind us, the great halls of the museum stood silent once more, their eerie shadows replaced by the hum of the waking world. Lestrade had taken Dr. Julian Whitmore into custody, his protests fading into grim resignation. The curator, Mr. Woodley, had thanked Holmes profusely before retreating into his office, no doubt to pen a report that would downplay the grisly details of the case. As we walked along Great Russell Street, I turned to Holmes. "You never did answer my question, Holmes. When did you first suspect Whitmore?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, do you recall the note Dr. Gresham left on his desk? The one with the partially written word?" I nodded. "Yes, W-H-I. We assumed he was attempting to write Whitmore." Holmes gave a small shake of his head. "A deliberate misdirection. Had Dr. Gresham truly been trying to name his killer, he would have written Julian, a far easier name to spell in the throes of death. No, I believe Gresham was writing something else entirely. It was not a name, but a warning. A warning? I echoed. Indeed, I suspect he was attempting to write white, as in the white robes often worn by those who revere the sacred artifacts of Egypt. Whitmore was known to have studied among such scholars, and it was that small detail that led me to examine his history more closely. I exhaled, shaking my head in admiration. "You never cease to amaze me, Holmes." Holmes chuckled. "A matter of observation, Watson, nothing more." As we approached Baker Street, Holmes glanced at me sideways. "Tell me, Watson, what do you make of Whitmore's beliefs? Did he act out of misguided righteousness, or was he simply another murderer hiding behind an ideal?" I considered the question carefully. Perhaps both. His convictions may have been genuine, but that does not excuse the lives he took. Holmes nodded approvingly. "A fair assessment. Many great evils in this world are born from ideals taken to dangerous extremes." We reached our familiar doorstep, and Holmes pushed the door open. The warm scent of Mrs. Hudson's breakfast greeted us, and I sighed in relief. The night had been long, and I welcomed the prospect of a hot meal. Holmes, however, did not head for the dining room. Instead, he went straight to his chair by the fireplace, lighting his pipe with an air of satisfaction. "The world is full of mysteries, Watson," he mused, "and for every one we solve, another waits in the shadows." I laughed, shaking my head. "Then I suppose you'll have us on another case before the day is out." Holmes exhaled, a thin stream of smoke, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Who knows, my dear Watson? The game is always afoot. A mystery concluded, a new one begins." The fire crackled softly in 221B Baker Street, casting flickering shadows across the walls as I set down my pen. The events of the past few days, now carefully recorded in my notes, seemed almost surreal in retrospect. A stolen artifact, an ancient curse, a murderer driven by misguided devotion. Truly, it had been a case unlike any other. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed absently upon the curling wisps of smoke from his pipe. His mind, I knew, was already miles away, wandering through the labyrinth of some new puzzle that had yet to present itself. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling contentedly. "You know, Holmes, there is something poetic in how this case ended. The dagger of the Pharaoh stolen, cursed, and reclaimed, only to remain here in London, locked away once more." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Poetic, perhaps, but also inevitable. Mankind has an insatiable appetite for relics of the past, Watson. Whether for knowledge, for wealth, or for power, such artifacts rarely remain untouched." I considered his words. "Do you believe someone else will try to steal it again?" Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. "In time, undoubtedly. History has a way of repeating itself. But that is not our concern for the moment. For now, the dagger is safe, and its legend will fade until the next ambitious soul seeks to awaken it." I shook my head with a chuckle. "And what of Whitmore? Will he face the gallows?" Holmes tapped his pipe against the edge of the fireplace. "That is for the courts to decide. His motives may earn him some sympathy, but justice will not overlook the blood on his hands." Silence settled between us, the warm glow of the fire making the room feel unusually peaceful. I allowed myself to relax, savouring the rare moment of quiet. But then, just as my eyes began to grow heavy, a sharp knock at the door shattered the tranquillity. Holmes straightened at once, his sharp features alight with interest. He glanced at me with an unmistakable glimmer of excitement. "Well, Watson," he murmured, rising to his feet, "it would seem that London has need of us once more." I sighed, pushing myself up from my chair. Another case already. Could we not have at least a day's rest? Holmes threw on his coat with a flourish, his eyes twinkling. "Nonsense, my dear Watson. The game is afoot." With that, he strode toward the door, pulling it open to greet our next mystery, and I, ever his loyal companion, followed close behind.